Welcome to the Deep Dive. It is Sunday, March 8th, 2026, and we're diving into a story today that completely flips the script on how we usually think about warfare.
We really are. And I think it's because when you picture World War II military history, it's so easy to default to that classic cinematic imagery.
Right, like famous generals dramatically pointing at maps in smoky rooms or visualizing these massive, sweeping strategic maneuvers that just change the borders of Europe overnight.
Exactly. But today we're taking a completely different angle. We are looking at a story built entirely on early crowdfunding, massive logistical lifelines, and a military unit that evolved through sheer stubborn resilience.
We are going to explore the incredibly unique history of the 112th Revolutionary Mongolia Tank Brigade.
And rather than just marching through a dry timeline of dates and battles, although there's certainly plenty of intense combat to cover, we're going to look at this as a masterclass in adaptability. It is a striking example of how the sharp end of the spear in warfare is entirely dependent on the civilians, standing thousands of miles behind the soldiers, holding the supply lines together.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are talking about a Soviet tank unit that was essentially bankrolled, clothed, and supplied by the neighboring People's Republic of Mongolia.
Right, in the absolute meat grinder of the Second World War.
Exactly. To really understand the scale and the sheer unlikeliness of this intersection between mechanized warfare and civilian contribution, we need to go back to the very beginning.
We do.
Let's look at the anatomy of this division and its brutal journey to the front lines. The 112th was born in August 1941 out in Primorsky Krai in the Russian Far East. And the first thing that stands out is that it did not start out as a brigade at all.
Right. It was initially formed as the 112th Peng Division, and they didn't just spin this up out of thin air.
No.
In the early stages of a massive conflict, militaries rarely have the luxury of building pristine units from scratch. They have to cobble them together from the fragments of existing forces.
Makes sense.
So they built this division on the foundation of the 112th Tank Regiment, parts of the 239th Motorized Division, and the 30th Mechanized Corps.
And just to clarify for you listening, a mechanized corps at that time was essentially a massive combined arms unit designed to bring infantry, artillery, and tanks together into one fast-moving fist.
But by August 1941, the situation was so dire, they were fundamentally restructuring these elements on the fly just to meet the immediate threat pushing into Soviet territory.
When you look at what they actually managed to pull together in the Far East, the scale is staggering. They had the 124th and 125th Tank Regiments, with 3 battalions each.
That is a lot of armor.
It is. Just to put a visual on that, we are talking about roughly 100 T-26 tanks idling in the staging areas.
Wow.
Add to that the 112th Motorized Regiment, a motorized howitzer regiment for mobile artillery support, an anti-tank battalion, and a sapper battalion.
And that sapper battalion is a crucial detail. That meant they had a dedicated unit of combat engineers whose entire job was to clear minefields, blow up obstacles, and build bridges.
Often while taking direct enemy fire.
Exactly. When you combine all that machinery, the artillery, the engineers, and the thousands of human beings required to operate it, you have a massive, heavy, incredibly complex footprint.
Which requires serious management.
Right. To manage an organization that large, you need highly capable leadership under immense pressure. Colonel Andrei Getman, who had been the chief of staff for the 30th Mechanized Corps, was put in charge.
He had a pretty solid command staff, right?
He did. It included his deputy, Colonel Plato Y. Mikhailov, the regimental commissar Yefim V. Bezmesov, and the chief of staff, Colonel Mikhail Leonov Trofimovich.
And their job was to somehow turn this sprawling collection of men and machines into a cohesive fighting force.
And they had almost no time to do it.
Time was a luxury they definitely didn't have. By mid-October 1941, command deemed them ready for the front. But simply getting to the combat zone in late 1941 was a terrifying ordeal.
It really was.
Imagine being strapped to a flatbed rail car, moving slowly across the vast expanse of the continent. You are a sitting duck.
Oh, absolutely.
On the morning of November 4th, before they had even reached the front lines, the train carrying the divisional headquarters was spotted and attacked by German aircraft somewhere between Ryazan and Moscow.
That's devastating.
2 soldiers were killed instantly, and 4 more were wounded. They didn't even manage to unload their trains at Podolsk until November 7th. They were literally bleeding before their boots hit the ground.
What's fascinating here is the sheer vulnerability of these deployments during transit. It's something that often gets overlooked in military history.
We just assume they magically appear at the battlefield.
Exactly. We picture tanks as these impenetrable steel beasts, But when they are chained down to a train, navigating a vulnerable rail network, they are completely defenseless.
Right.
Moving an entire mechanized division from the Russian Far East all the way to the defense of Moscow is a logistical nightmare even in peacetime.
Yeah.
When you add enemy air superiority actively trying to sever those rail lines, it is honestly a miracle that the division arrived cohesive enough to function as a fighting unit at all.
And they had to function immediately. They stepped right into their baptism by fire in late 1941, becoming part of the 6th Tank Corps under the 1st Tank Army.
Which leads to a very strange tactical setup.
It creates one of the most jarring, almost cinematic visuals of the entire war. The Western Front headquarters decided to create a mobile mechanized cavalry group.
Right.
They took the under 12 tank division and paired them directly with a cavalry corps commanded by General Alexander Belov.
It sounds like a glitch in the timeline, doesn't it?
It really does. If you are picturing this, you literally have internal combustion engines and heavy armor operating in tandem with thousands of soldiers riding on horseback, all fighting to prevent the German capture of Tula.
The clash of centuries. You have the ancient tradition of horse cavalry working alongside the raw industrial power of tanks.
Why did they even do that? It seems so counterintuitive.
You have to understand the environment of the Eastern Front in late 1941. It was muddy, chaotic, and the infrastructure was collapsing.
Right, the infamous mud.
Exactly. In that specific tactical reality, pairing mechanized firepower with the all-terrain, mud-ignoring mobility of horses was a highly practical, albeit desperate, solution to a dire problem.
Because the horses could go where the tanks couldn't.
Yes, the horses could navigate forests and swamps where the older tanks would simply bog down.
Well, their first joint combat action kicked off on November 16th, 1941, right in the freezing thick of the Battle of Moscow. They launched an offensive pushing toward Maliv, Vyazovka, and Vysokonichi.
But it did not go according to plan.
No, it didn't. They ran into incredibly strong, entrenched resistance and failed to achieve any substantial results right out of the gate. It was a harsh, violent introduction to the reality of the front line.
It was a brutal setback.
Mm.
But the defining characteristic of this unit was how quickly they learned and adapted.
They bounced back fast.
Very fast. Shortly after that initial failure, they found their footing. During subsequent combat operations to the west and northwest of Serpukhov, they engaged the German 30th Corps and successfully repelled their attack.
And that's not a small thing.
Not at all. This wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a massive psychological boost. They proved to themselves and to high command that they could hold their ground against a concerted, highly organized assault.
And because they proved they could hold the line, High Command completely shifted how they were utilized. They essentially became the ultimate fire brigade.
A very dangerous job.
Very. They were urgently transferred to Kashira, and their specific vital mission was to protect the hospitals and the rear service areas to prevent a catastrophic German breakthrough.
And as a fire brigade, they weren't holding static trenches.
No, they were constantly rushing to the hottest, most dangerous parts of the map. They conducted these desperate, high-stakes counterattacks directly onto the flanks of enemy groups just to relieve the pressure on the dangerously thin defense lines of the 49th and 50th Armies.
It was a desperate stabilization effort.
The situation was so chaotic that for a brief window between December 7th and the 10th, they were entirely merged with the 340th Rifle Division under a single command just to keep the front from collapsing.
This raises an important question about the brutal mathematics of attrition in mechanized warfare. For their vital work stabilizing that line, the unit was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, which is a massive honor.
But at what cost?
Exactly. The intense, non-stop combat took a devastating toll on their equipment and their personnel. You cannot operate as a fire brigade without taking heavy casualties.
So they had to restructure.
On January 7, 1942, the division was officially reorganized. They were condensed from the massive 112th Tank Division into the leaner 112th Tank Brigade.
Downsizing.
Yes, their sprawling regiments were downsized into tighter battalions. They were essentially compacting their surviving strength into a more manageable, highly experienced corps based on the realities of the losses they had suffered.
With those kinds of punishing losses, how does a unit even stay operational? They must have been bleeding equipment faster than the factories could replace it.
It was a massive crisis.
And this is exactly where the story pivots from standard military history into something completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yes, it does.
We move into 1943, and we see what I can only describe as a crowdfunding miracle. In 1943, this newly condensed, battle-hardened 112th Tank Brigade officially receives the title Revolutionary Mongolia.
It's a remarkable geopolitical intervention.
Yeah.
The neighboring People's Republic of Mongolia, under the leadership of Marshal Korlugin Choibalsan, essentially adopted this specific Soviet tank brigade.
Adopted them, like, financially.
Yes, the funding for this massive contribution was spearheaded by a Mongolian political figure named Gonchagin Bunsen. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a total logistical overhaul.
Is wild.
On January 17, 1943, a Mongolian delegation arrived at the front to present the brigade with a completely upgraded arsenal.
And we are talking about a massive technological leap. The Mongolian donation entirely re-equipped the brigade with 34 T-3476 tanks and 21 T-70 tanks.
Huge upgrade.
For you listening, if you are not familiar with the hardware, earlier we mentioned they started with T-26 tanks, which were older, lightly armored, and highly vulnerable.
The T-34, on the other hand, was an absolute game changer.
Right. It had thick, sloped armor that could deflect enemy shells, wide tracks for the mud, and a heavy gun. It was a beast.
Marshal Choibalsan even personally presented one of the tanks to the brigade himself.
But honestly, as incredible as the tanks were, the most mind-blowing part of this story is the care package that came with them. Imagine 237 fully loaded railway wagons rolling into the depot.
The inventory of those 237 wagons is staggering when you break it down.
Yeah.
We are talking about 1,000 tons of meat, 90 tons of oil, 80 tons of sausages.
Wait, hold on. 150 tons of confectionery, like candy and sweets for the soldiers, right in the middle of the most brutal war in history.
Exactly. 150 tons of candy just to boost morale in the freezing mud. And for the cold, they sent 30,000 coats, 30,000 pairs of boots, and 30,000 fur-padded winter jackets.
That is unbelievable. 30,000 fur-padded jackets.
You really have to look at the broader context of what that means. Mongolia in the 1940s was not a massive, heavily industrialized superpower churning out goods in automated factories.
Right, they didn't have massive assembly lines.
It was a predominantly pastoral economy. Gathering 1,000 tons of meat and hand-stitching 30,000 winter jackets represented a monumental society-wide sacrifice.
It really puts it into perspective.
It was an entire nation of everyday civilians actively tightening their own belts, sacrificing their own comfort and resources to ensure that the soldiers of an allied nation fighting thousands of miles away could stay warm, stay fed, and stay in the fight.
The psychological impact of that on the soldiers must have been immeasurable. You are freezing in a trench, and suddenly a train rolls up with a fur coat and candy donated by a civilian in another country who wanted you to survive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that profound gesture had an immediate ripple effect. The sheer success and the incredible morale boost of this Revolutionary Mongolia tank brigade directly inspired another massive crowdfunding effort.
The aviation unit, right.
Yes. It led to the creation of a similarly funded aviation unit, the Mongolian Arat Squadron, in the Soviet Air Force. The concept of a neighboring civilian population entirely outfitting specific military units became a powerful tool for solidarity.
Armed with those new, heavily armored T-34s and wrapped in those thick winter coats, the brigade began a legacy that is quite literally etched in steel.
Their momentum really shifts here.
As we move from 1943 onward, the brigade falls under the command of I. Gusakovsky, a leader who would go on to become a double hero of the Soviet Union. Under his command, the unit just begins this relentless march across the map of Europe.
And as the war progressed, they received even more advanced, upgunned versions of the T-34. Their combat record becomes a defining history of the late war.
The operational tempo they sustained from 1943 to 1945 is difficult to overstate. They didn't just participate in minor skirmishes, they were the tip of the spear in the massive counteroffensives that eventually broke the back of the German military and ended the war in Europe.
Right, let's look at where they fought. They were thrown into the Battle of Kursk.
And Kursk wasn't just a battle, it was an absolute meat grinder of steel and artillery, standing as one of the largest armored clashes in human history. To survive Kursk in a tank required immense skill and luck.
From there, it was the Zhytomyr Berdichev offensive, fighting through the bitter cold of the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket.
They pushed through the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive, rolling right into the Vistula-Oder and East Pomeranian offensives.
They literally drove their Mongolian-funded tanks from the desperate defensive lines near Moscow all the way through the continent, straight into the final apocalyptic urban combat of the Berlin offensive.
And you can precisely track the significance of their tactical contributions by looking at the sheer weight of the decorations they accumulated along the way.
In military tradition, units wear their history on their banners, and the banner of the 112th was heavily, heavily adorned by the end of the conflict.
They practically ran out of room for medals.
Pretty much. They were awarded the Order of Lenin, which is the highest civilian and military decoration. They received the Order of Suvorov Second Class, the Order of Kutuzov Second Class, the Order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky Second Class, and the Order of the Red Star.
And a specific battle honor, too.
Yes. They also earned the specific Battle Honor Berdichev for their critical breakthrough actions during that specific offensive.
It's an incredible resume. And the Mongolian government, who had sparked that mid-war resurgence, was right there with them, continuing to honor their bond even decades after the guns fell silent.
The relationship endured long after the war.
Historical records show that in 1964, the unit was awarded the Order of Damdan Sukbatar by Mongolia. And what's fascinating is how the unit itself just kept evolving as the world changed.
Right. They didn't just vanish.
After the war ended, the 112th Revolutionary Mongolia Tank Brigade didn't just disband, it transitioned. It became the 44th Guards Tank Brigade.
And then it shifted again.
Later, as the military modernized and shrank, it downsized into the 44th Guards Tank Regiment. Finally, jumping all the way ahead to 1993, it evolved once more into the 44th Guards Tank Training Regiment.
Garrisoned at Vladimir as part of the 467th Guards District Training Center.
Which is really the most natural, honorable life cycle for a highly decorated frontline unit.
Absolutely. They preserve the institutional memory, they keep the battle honors and the banners, but their day-to-day function shifts entirely to passing down that hard-won, incredibly costly expertise to the next generation of soldiers.
But crucially, that civilian connection, that unbelievable lifeline forged in the darkest days of 1943, was never forgotten by either side.
No, it wasn't. In 2003, exactly 60 years after that massive 237-wagon delivery of tanks, candy, and winter coats, the Zaysan Memorial was erected in Mongolia specifically to commemorate the historic role of the brigade.
And sitting right there, elevated as the centerpiece of the memorial, is a surviving T-34 tank.
So what does this all mean?
When you look back at the entire life cycle of this brigade, from a massive, hastily assembled division bleeding on train cars, to a desperate fire brigade fighting alongside horses, to a modernized spearhead pushing into Berlin, and finally to a modern training center, it completely changes how you view military logistics.
It really does. It wasn't just about tactics on a map.
A military unit can only fight, adapt, and survive as long as it has the fuel, the armor, the warm boots, and the calories provided by the people supporting them. It is a testament to the astonishing power of international civilian-funded willpower.
I want to leave you with a final thought to really contextualize everything we've explored today.
Yeah.
Think about that one surviving T-34 tank sitting at the Zaysan Memorial, erected in 2003.
Yeah.
If you just glance at it in passing, it is very easy to see it as just a rusted piece of military hardware, a static relic of a very violent past. But having gone through this deep dive, maybe you could look at that machine a bit differently now.
I know I do.
Imagine that single steel tank as a physical manifestation of 150 tons of confectionery. Picture it representing 30,000 winter coats stitched together by families in a pastoral economy, and the collective willpower of an entire neighboring nation refusing to let their allies freeze.
It's powerful.
What does it say about humanity that our most enduring monuments to international friendship, generosity, and solidarity are sometimes forged in the terrifying crucible of armored warfare?
It is a profound paradox perfectly captured in steel. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a fresh perspective on how history is made not just by generals moving pieces on a board, but by everyday people organizing, sacrificing, and sending what they can to those who need it most. Stay curious, keep exploring the hidden human stories behind the monuments around you, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.